Honourable Judges and my other judicial colleagues, Mr. Attorney, Mr. Solicitor, the UN Independent Expert on Albinism, Ms. Ero, fellow speakers and commentators, members of the Attorney's Chambers, members of the Bar, and attendees of this conference, including Mr. Amrit Sen and his delegates from the helicopter. Following the disabilities session, I have to admit, no, I can't. What an amazing film that was. And I feel similarly disabled when Mr. Raj had deleted the felicitations from his opening. I have chosen the general title, Whom to be Tried by, Judges, Juries or Assessors. 'Tis of course a very wide topic. I shall touch upon only a few points. I have avoided the phrase as set out in the programme, ordinary people or judges. It has an unsettling echo with that other contemporary phrase, real people, sometimes used by deeply insincere persons managing public relations departments of large corporations claiming to be genuinely organic. And anyway, cannot judges and magistrates claim, if not to their wives, at least to the rest of the population, that they also are merely ordinary? The issue of concern, as I see it, is for the court to provide the right verdict on the criminal charges brought before it. The right verdict being a forensically accurate assessment of the evidence, and on the issue as to whether the evidence does or does not prove the necessary elements of the offence. In addition, the law is to be interpreted correctly and applied to the facts accepted as proven. Both steps to be pursued independently, impartially, and at times courageously. For some decisions will be unpopular, not thought to be correct, and be subject to adverse or abusive comment. The commentators are rarely ones that have been present in court, observing the fairness of proceedings, the according of process, or to have listened to the witnesses and the evidence emerging, and therefore, like the court, to be in a position to assess the strengths and weaknesses of those witnesses on a determinative and controversial aspect of the case. In the O.J. Simpson case, a number of persons of expertise and experience sat through the entire trial and held opinions on its level of fairness on how the jury arrived at its decision. There were many diverse views on these points, but at least their opinions, right or wrong, were based on first-hand experience. Is it a democratic procedure? I often hear this point being argued. The composition of the court for the decision, it is said, must be democratic. Some rail at non-elected judges deciding the fate of the accused. This is heard in American circles. It stems from the desire of the Founding Fathers to remove themselves from the 17th century religious oppression suffered by religious or denominational minorities in England. Not only were the minorities, whether Catholics, Puritans or Quakers, hounded by the established church, they suffered from the bias in favour of the king and the established order at the hands of the king's judges. In the new settlements of America, they could elect their own judges, who could try them with greater independence and perhaps, so they thought, with greater empathy, if not sympathy. They had endured the dangers and rigours of boat people, if not quite as dangerously as for Libyans, West Africans, and the Rohingya of today. But if it is accuracy and care we require, a cold analysis of the actual evidence available, as presented in court, that putting aside of gossip and what has been heard in the media, seen on the TV, or read on social media, is it not wise to require a more distanced view of the final state of the evidence? A people's court could easily degenerate into something resembling the French Revolution. How many acquittals were ever pronounced in those courts? Even the French general, the Marquis de Lafayette, who fought for the rebels in the American War of Independence and returned a revolutionary hero to France, lost his mother, his aunt, and his grandmother to the guillotine. He was unable to save them from the kangaroo courts that convicted them. They were aristocrats. What more evidence was needed? Popular hate figures, be they child molesters or Islamist bombers, need from our system careful process lest we ourselves lose our sense of civilization, fairness, equality, and justice. When we have a physical ailment requiring an operation, do we wish to obtain the services of a highly competent surgeon, anaesthetist, and his team if we can? Do we therefore put the selection of the surgeon to a democratic choice, to an election? I think not. With respect, the efficacy of the type of court needed to decide criminal trials should not depend upon a democratic process. Judges, assessors, or juries are neither better nor worse for not being selected by popular ballot, rather than by appointment randomly for the next trial in the list. Judges. Much has been written about the inadequacies of judges. They are, after all, usually of ordinary ability when it comes to assessing truthfulness and reliability. No better than anyone else in the community, though they may occasionally be able lawyers, advocates, and wordsmiths. Many years ago, I remember a case in the appeal courts. The appeal was going badly for the female appellant. Then she broke down and wept, as they say, inconsolably. The elderly men on the bench were moved, and in the result, her sentence was suspended. It was difficult to discern the determinative principle that gained the appellant her relief. Difficult to pinpoint the reason for mercy as against any other similar offender. The strength of judges over the man or woman in the street will be engaging the sufficiency of evidence to meet the individual elements of the charge, and in returning a decision logically when the evidence completes those elements. There's less likely to be a jury's sympathy verdict, as you had in the O.J. Simpson case, or as I remember in London Crown Court trials, where the jury's verdict often reflected distrust of the police. Corruption there may have been, and falsifying of evidence, in order to secure convictions, usually against repetitive, petty offenders. But the application of prejudice means each case will not be considered separately and without the commitment to disregard irrelevancies. Some history. John Langbein was of the view that the jury system in which local laypersons decided civil and criminal cases was the defining institution of the English common law. Having said that, he went on to add, I quote, "My theme is that the jury system severely impaired the development of the judicial function in English law," end of quote. We know that jury trials in civil matters are largely unheard of in England today. They're not conducted in Fiji. Langbein was also of the view that the facts were almost more important than the law, and that judges were therefore not to be excluded from this crucial function. It has often been said that a good judge is a judge that gets the facts right. The law can then easily be applied or corrected later by the Court of Appeal. The American Judge Jerome Frank, pithily said, "The jury applies law it doesn't understand to facts it can't get straight." At times, the technical directions thought appropriate by appellate courts for the ordinary men and women of the jury are confusing. The bench book of one nearby jurisdiction, setting out suitable directions to the jury on circumstantial evidence, is, as McGarry J. might have said, a prince of obfuscating muddle and confusion. How could they have thought the jury would understand it? The directions on conspiracy are even worse. Jury trials arose out of the struggle in England between the king and his barons. The common man did not seem so significant a consideration in this battle. In 1215, King John at Runnymede had little choice but to accept Magna Carta. If he did not, he knew he would lose his throne. Chapter 39 of the document stated, "No free man is to be taken or imprisoned, or disseized or outlawed or exiled, or in any way destroyed, nor will we go upon him, nor will we send upon him, except by the lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land." I had occasion to deal with this issue, the question of peers, in the sense of trial by one's equals. In the State versus Ratu Inokitakive Carta, ruling number 5 in November 2004, the authorities were reviewed in this way. In his treatise, Tried by Their Peers, Rupert Fenno said of the concept, "On conviction of treason or felony, lands were forfeited or escheated to the Crown, and without some safeguard, any tenant-in-chief who owned land the king desired might be legally robbed on a trumped-up charge of treason or felony. The assertion of the claim of the tenants-in-chief to be judged by other tenants-in-chief was a check on the royal prerogative and a defence of its property by the baronage in its long struggle with the Crown. The king was not above packing the court with members of his own party. Therefore, to be tried by one's own peers offered some protection against the triumph of the dominant and revengeful party of the moment." Is that familiar? The purpose of the right was to achieve greater impartiality rather than to recognise status and to accord privilege. Indeed, Sir James Whitlock, one of the judges in the trial of Lord Audley in 1631, gave a preliminary ruling that trial by peers was not a procedure that could be waived, since it was part of the law established by Magna Carta and not a privilege. In 1935, Lord de Clifford was the last peer to be so tried. He succeeded on a no-case-to-answer submission, in which the Lords consulted the judges before delivering their ruling. At the time of the trial, there was an outcry in the press about what was seen as class privilege in such a mode of trial. Lord de Clifford's solicitors had referred to it as this doubtful privilege. It was finally abolished in 1948, by which time it was regarded as an anachronism. In the case of Walker in 1988, Macpherson J. dealt with the meaning of trial by peers and referred to an historical essay by Richard Thompson, published in 1829. And I quote from that judgment, in which it is suggested that the word peer was probably originally derived of the Latin par, and equal, adding that the trial by equals is of great antiquity. To accept that what is required by Chapter 39 is a trial by equals is effectively to dispose of the appellant's second ground of appeal, for in contemporary Australia, all individuals are equal before the law. And whatever else may be said about those who comprise the jury at the trial of the applicant in this case, they were at law certainly all his equals, as he was of them. And the judge concluded, "There is nothing at all in the record to suggest that the jury before whom the appellant's trial in the district court proceeded was not formed from a panel selected and summoned in the manner provided by the provisions of the Jury Act. The fact, if it be so, that the panel included no new-knuckle people may have been attributable to chance or to the limits prescribed under Section 11 of the Jury District of Brisbane. However that may be, it does not follow that the appellant did not receive trial by a jury of his peers or equals, and even if it did, it would not signify. The provisions of the Jury Act regulating the composition of juries were complied with at his trial, and if in conflict with Chapter 39 of Magna Carta, the provisions of Chapter 39 are, to that extent, impliedly repealed. In 1713, Alexander Pope, writing his mock-heroic narrative poem, The Rape of the Lock, referred disparagingly to the lack of conscientiousness in the performance of trial duties when he penned the couplet, "The hungry judges soon the sentence sign, and wretches hang, that jurymen may dine." The jurymen in those days had to be landowners and persons of some substance. They were not, therefore, of the rank or class of the persons of the cases that they tried. They were nonetheless, in law, their equals. We remember the American Declaration of Independence and its famous preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There were inequalities, it appeared, in the status of the inhabitants of the state. One of the authors of the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, was unable by his will to release more than 8 of his 200 plantation slaves. There were doubts, too, on the composition of juries. Invariably, the black slave looked across the courtroom at 12 white faces. As the cases indicate, not all differences can or should necessarily be eradicated. In Canada, the Jurors Act was amended in 1988 to permit an Indian or Inuk in the Northwest Territories, even though he did not speak French or English fluently, to serve as a juror if the accused was an Indian or an Inuk. Compassionate as this sounds, obviously with intention to reassure the accused, the alleviation still presents the further problem. What if the complainant was a Russian or a Japanese? How will the complainant feel? In the State versus Timothy Naisaki, a Fiji case of January 2001, counsel for the defense applied to have an assessor replaced by a male Itoke Fijian. The existing female Fijian assessor was sought to be replaced as having no understanding of the accused's background or circumstances. It was an application for gender balance. There were 3 female assessors. Shamim J. said, quote, "The question, therefore, is whether the panel of 3 women representing the 3 largest ethnic groups of Fiji can sit and render its opinion impartially and fairly." The judge rejected arguments suggesting that a privileged background going with fluency in English and different economic circumstances disqualified the assessors from hearing the accused's case. Just returning for a minute briefly to that complainant point, sometimes there were cases in Cyprus which had to be held either by a Turkish judge or a Greek judge. But the problem was, of course, what happens when the complainant was Greek and the person accused was Turkish? Who are you assisting? The law must be impartial. And it cannot, even though there's a difference between the poor man in Alabama in the 1830s facing 12 white faces and he is a slave being charged with an offense, we can sympathize with him if he feels he's not necessarily before an impartial court. But the issue is not the fact that they're white faces or black faces. The issue is the impartiality of the panel. Who is going to try you must be impartial. That is the issue. The public interest is in having a fair trial, not one overly sympathetic either to the complainant or to the accused. Attempts are made to have a diverse panel by reason of race, gender, or occupation, but ideal balance is not always easily and randomly possible. The prime consideration must be impartiality, rather than compassionate understanding. It's to be without fear or favour. Judge and assessors in Fiji. Preparation of lists of assessors is usually done every 2 years. Details of this process, liability to serve, exemptions and summoning attendance is dealt with in the Criminal Procedure Act, sections 204 to 212. The qualifications for service are that the assessor must be between 24 and 70 years old, a citizen of Fiji, and have a competent knowledge of the English language. Apart from exempted persons, those disabled by mental infirmity or who have been convicted of any offence punishable with imprisonment for more than 5 years and who have not received a pre-pardon are ineligible for service. Procedure for objection to an assessor is covered in section 224. It must be for cause. There has to be a proper reason for objection, unlike in challenging a juror in England, where some challenges are permitted without need for reasons to be given. Persons related to the accused or the witnesses or who have knowledge of the case or the parties cannot serve. Any conflict can be raised and the court can disqualify for any other proper reason. The court had to be careful in some cases when we found that the names and addresses of witnesses were published on social media and the names of their children and the schools that they attended. And so in balancing the various rights, it was clear that we must make sure there is an impartial panel, not subject to any kind of threats. The system handed down from the colonial government. Well, the colonial governments realised that expatriate judges may not understand all of the local customs, manners, and nuances which may affect the consideration of the evidence and its purport. Therefore, the original penal code first provided for trial judges to be assisted by local assessors. If a judge views the evidence in one way, and all 3 assessors are of a different view, a judge will not rush into a judgment setting out his or her own opinion. It has become the practice in Fiji to set out, even in a judgment concurring with the opinions of the assessors, some reasons for doing so. If there is disagreement, the judge will have reflected upon the contrary opinions and reconsider his or her own assessment of the witnesses and evidence. Only then should the final judgment be composed, setting out his or her decision with cogent reasons. What is often hard to grasp by judges not operating in the Fiji jurisdiction is that the final decision, indeed the only decision on the law and the facts, reposes with the judge. Reasons must be given. The judgment must already be committed to writing prior to its delivery in open court. And as you know, all of these rulings and summings up, sentencing remarks, judgments of conviction or acquittal are usually available very quickly on the internet, on PACLI, and are distributed usually on the day of the decision to the press. So far as this procedure of the judge's role in the trial in the High Court, the position was traversed in Takive Carta in pages 17 to 21, which reviewed the cases. It is a confusion to consider the Fiji system as a system of trial by jury, nor is it a trial by judge alone, as in the days of the terrorism in the troubles of Northern Ireland. The judge here is wise to reflect on any differing opinions coming from the assessors, though ultimately the opinion and the verdict is his or hers, and at times a melancholy duty. This system is able to cope better than jury trials in 2 particular types of cases: arson, usually with insurance and related fraud, and the trials of powerful, influential persons of high rank or of celebrities. In the past, there have been some perverse decisions by assessors in fraud cases where there is a suspicion of money having been placed. In these and in reviewing the cases, the judges have probably been faced with overwhelming evidence, and the judge has arrived at a sound decision in which he has not taken the opinions of the assessors, not followed them anyway. In the cases against persons of fame or rank, sometimes assessors are overwhelmed with embarrassment and some fear. They live in a small community, generally, where loyalty may be valued more than what many know to be the truth. Well, in conclusion, I'd say many commentators say juries have delivered sympathy verdicts in some cases, and acquittal rates are higher. In some, they will be right to do so. But the combination of views of assessors and judges can work well. In my time as counsel, prosecutor and defence, as well as a judicial officer, I've generally considered decisions to be fair and accurate. Thank you.